Something was wrong long before the ambassador's heart gave out. A silence too deliberate, a dinner too elegant, a guest list too carefully curated. In a world where truth is traded for influence and secrets are buried in footnotes, one man dared to ask the wrong question at the wrong table. Now, in a brownstone filled with orchids and observation, justice prepares to bloom, quietly, relentlessly. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. It was the sort of Wednesday that makes you contemplate criminal activity, just to give the day some shape. Wolfe was upstairs among his orchids. Fritz was muttering in German over something that involved veal and perfection. And I was in the office, staring at the top corner of a file folder like it owed me money. That was when the bell rang. Not the regular buzz, but the old-fashioned ding from the street door, which we reserve for visitors who might be important, insane, or wearing medals. The man who entered was the kind of butler you suspect is trained in assassination between tea services. Immaculate tailcoat, silver tray, posture like a sword. He handed me a thick envelope sealed in gold foil and scented like someone had wiped it down with aristocratic regret. "For Mr. Nero Wolfe," he said, and turned on his heel, like he was leading a funeral for discretion itself. I carried the envelope to Wolfe's desk like it might explode, which, knowing the social circles it came from, wasn't entirely out of the question. Wolfe came down 5 minutes later. He opened it. He grunted. Then he glared at me, like I'd scheduled the apocalypse during orchid time. "I do not attend receptions," Wolfe declared, flinging the word receptions as if it were diseased. I was perched in my usual chair, trying to look like a man who hadn't already read the invitation. It was from His Excellency Viktor Vasilyev, Ambassador of the Russian Federation, requesting our presence at a diplomatic cocktail gathering at some ritzy private club uptown. I opened my mouth. Wolfe raised a finger. "I do not stand. I do not sip. I do not feign interest in poultry speared on toothpicks." "You forgot international harmony," I said. He sighed. "You will attend. You are presentable when fresh accents from continents that don't share borders nicely." Waiters glided like trained doves with flutes of champagne, and a string quartet murmured something Chopin-adjacent from behind a curtain. I scanned the room like a man looking for fire exits, or anyone too polished to be here for the shrimp. A pair of African diplomats were arguing over ice cubes. A British MP in a blue cravat was flirting with someone's secretary and someone else's wife. The art on the walls was modern in that way that suggests price tags bigger than meaning. And there, near the far window, stood the man himself. Ambassador Viktor Vasilyev, resplendent in a double-breasted suit and a smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. Something about the room felt staged, the warmth too practiced, the laughter slightly delayed. It was a party, sure, but someone had written a script. I moved through the crowd like a waiter with no tray, nodding here, smirking there, collecting names for Wolfe's inevitable post-mortem debrief. There was a Frenchman with perfect posture and a smirk that suggested knowledge of more than wine. Name, Luc Durand. Supposed art dealer, though his fingers looked better suited for silencing people than framing them. Then there was her, Isabel Vance, the senator's daughter. You could tell from the way she sipped champagne like it was strategy. She was all pearls and politics, flushed cheeks, and the kind of smile that got used as bait in spy novels. I asked a waiter for his name. He disappeared instead. The staff was either new, imported, or rehearsed. I made a mental note of faces, which ones avoided eye contact, which ones lingered too long. One man had a lapel pin from a country whose flag changed last year. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. The room hummed with the kind of tension you only feel when someone's keeping a secret and someone else plans to expose it. I started keeping track of glasses. Who held one? Who didn't? Who filled whose? At these events, the toast always comes before the truth. Ambassador Vasiliev stepped forward, gently clinking his flute against the edge of a silver tray. Conversation ebbed. The quartet stopped mid-swell. "Friends," he began, his accent wrapping around the word like velvet, stretched too tight. "Tonight we gather not merely in celebration, but in peace. A peace forged not by silence, but by understanding." Even among wolves, a ripple of diplomatic laughter, not hearty, not real, the kind used to cover discomfort. He lifted his glass. I noticed two things. First, his hand trembled. Not much, just a flicker. Enough to make the champagne swirl like it knew something. Second, Isabel Vance's eyes flicked toward him. Not with admiration, but with calculation. The ambassador smiled again, wider this time. Too wide, and then he drank. I don't know what I expected to follow that line about wolves, but I didn't expect the man to fall like one shot. There's a sound people make when they see someone die. It's not a scream, it's sharper, like air being sucked through porcelain. That's the sound the room made when Vasiliev dropped. 1 second he was upright, delivering lines fit for a marble statue. The next he was crumpled on the polished floor, his glass shattering beside him like a fallen verdict. For a moment no one moved. Then chaos, but the polite, upscale kind. People gasped in British. A woman clutched pearls like they'd stop a heart attack. A man called for a doctor, who was already kneeling beside the body. I pushed closer, flashing the kind of confident smirk that lets you get away with things in expensive rooms. I crouched. Vasiliev was gone. His eyes stared at the chandelier, like he'd just remembered something important, and then let it go. The doctor muttered, "Cardiac," but I wasn't buying. The man hadn't just fallen, he'd folded. Like someone had yanked the strings inside. I saw the glass. The stem intact. I saw the canapé on his plate, untouched. I saw, tucked under the edge of the silver tray, a napkin with a crimson lip print that hadn't come from a rug, like someone had pulled the plug on a music box and we were all stuck mid-spin. I was the first to move. Occupational habit. I elbowed through a hedge of foreign blazers and clutched pearls, kneeling beside what was now unquestionably a corpse in a tuxedo. His eyes were wide open and still fixed on the crystal chandelier, not in fear, but in a kind of grim understanding, like he'd figured out the ending a page too late. The crowd held its collective breath while someone murmured the word "doctor." A woman dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, more out of social obligation than shock. I looked around the room, not for a hero, but for the one who'd seen it coming. And it wasn't me, but it was someone. A man in a well-tailored navy suit shouldered through the crowd and dropped beside the ambassador. "I'm a physician," he declared, always a reassuring start. He loosened the tie, checked for a pulse, and began compressions with all the enthusiasm of a Broadway understudy hoping for a matinee. I watched the crowd instead. The Frenchman, Durand, had taken 2 steps back and was now conveniently inspecting the wine list. Isabel Vance, the senator's daughter, stood perfectly still, her glass untouched. Her expression wasn't grief or panic, it was concentration, like someone mentally revising a speech. One man edged toward the double doors. I caught his eye and smiled. He froze. The doctor's hands worked dutifully. The rest of the room stood like mannequins with country flags. I bent close enough to see the hint of froth at Vasiliev's lips. Either his heart quit in dramatic fashion, or something helped it along. The club manager arrived just as the doctor gave up. He was the kind of man born to deny scandal. Sleek hair, smoother voice, and a vocabulary tailored to tragedy. "Very unfortunate," he murmured. "It appears to be a cardiac event." There it was. The phrase that solves everything and explains nothing. I mentally counted down. 5, 4, 3. Sure enough, someone muttered, "Natural causes." By then, a staff member had already phoned the Russian consulate, and another was hustling the string quartet off stage like this was an unscheduled intermission. A few guests reached for their coats. Others hovered by the champagne table, like waiting toasts might still be appropriate. I watched a waiter discreetly remove Vasiliev's plate. No police, no investigation. Just calm voices and quiet arrangements. Whatever happened here, they were smoothing it over like spilled wine on linen. But I'd seen enough to know that wasn't wine. I leaned in, careful not to look too interested. The ambassador's champagne flute was tipped on its side, the last few drops tracing a slow path along the base. No one else had touched it. Not even a clumsy waiter nearby had an excuse to swap it out. That glass had been his and his alone. I scanned the bar setup. The bottle, vintage Krug, chilled just shy of frostbite, still rested in its silver cradle. The cork had been popped barely 10 minutes earlier, and I could still see the wire cage resting neatly beside it. A detail man would have noticed who brought the bottle. I had. It was the ambassador's aide, Alexei Mirov, who handled the pour. Confident, routine, practiced. The kind of man who knew his boss's schedule and his liquor preferences. Except Mirov wasn't in the room now. Not among the murmuring diplomats. Not outside by the doors. Not even with the club staff. The man who had filled the ambassador's glass had vanished. I made a mental note to find him, if the Russian consulate didn't first. Or worse, if someone else had already found him, and made sure he wouldn't be pouring anything again. The ambassador's plate was still there, one canapé untouched, artfully arranged, but clearly abandoned. I'd seen him eye it earlier, but never lift a hand toward it. My instincts, which Wolfe politely calls crude intuition, told me to get a souvenir. So I slid a cocktail napkin from under the plate. Brownstone. It was 11:03. I came bearing two things: bad news and a cocktail napkin with kissable evidence. Wolfe was in his chair, in his robe, with a book open and beer half finished. He didn't look up. "Well," he said. "Your instincts were half right," I said. He toasted. He toppled. They're calling it heart failure. The press will run with it by morning. Wolfe snorted. "Pah! Did he eat?" "Nope, but he drank." Wolfe looked at me now, slow and careful. "From what?" "Champagne flute. One glass. From one bottle. Served by his aide, who pulled a Houdini 10 minutes later." Fritz entered, bearing cheese straws and a disapproving frown at my tie. I handed Wolfe the napkin and the shrimp canapé, wrapped like a guilty secret. He sniffed. "Aconitine, perhaps. Or muscarine, Fritz, your expertise." Fritz took it like I'd offered him spoiled caviar, muttering about poisons and culinary blasphemy. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, and said, "No natural death smells of orchestration." Meaning? Meaning someone rehearsed this. And I had the distinct feeling that someone had also rehearsed what would happen next, if anyone like me started poking around. The Russian consulate didn't waste time. Less than 24 hours after Vasiliev's curtain call, they issued a statement so dry it might have cracked if folded. It ran in the evening papers, third page, lower half, under the headline, "Ambassador Vasiliev dies unexpectedly at private event." The body of the piece read like it had been run through a typewriter soaked in starch. No signs of foul play. No comment on ongoing medical concerns. The ambassador's service to international dialogue will be remembered with respect and discretion. Translated, We're not answering questions, and we'd appreciate it if you didn't ask any. I read it twice, mostly for laughs. It was a masterclass in diplomatic misdirection. No hint of surprise, no mention of the aid, and not even a whiff of poison. Just one big bureaucratic brush-off.
Wolfe, of course, read it once. Then he grunted and said, "They're hiding something," which, frankly, was the only part of the press release that felt honest. At 7:02 the next morning, as I was polishing off coffee and a cinnamon roll that Fritz claimed was a mistake, the doorbell rang. That specific chime reserved for people in suits who don't do surprise visits unless someone's dead or about to be. I opened it to find a tall, silver-haired man with the posture of someone who'd spent the last 20 years carrying secrets and dry-clean-only documents. He handed me a card. Miles Calder, Private Legal Counsel to Ambassador Vasiliev. "I was told Mr. Wolfe might receive me without prior appointment," he said, voice quiet, clipped, with the kind of diction you get when you're paid not to sweat. "Depends," I replied. "Are you offering money, danger, or just the chance to hear yourself talk?" He didn't laugh. I let him in. Wolfe was at his desk, pretending not to be curious. Calder sat without being asked, which Wolfe hates, and removed a slim leather folder. "I believe the ambassador's death was not natural," he said calmly. "There are reasons, quiet ones." Wolfe blinked. "And more importantly, I believe someone wanted it to look natural." Then he said the word poison, and that changed everything. "I trust, Mr. Wolfe," Calder continued. "You understand that discretion is not merely a preference. It is a necessity." He reached into his briefcase and placed a thick envelope on the desk, like it contained something unspeakable, or highly negotiable. From the way it thunked, I guessed cash. From the way Wolfe's eyebrow arched, I knew I was right. "No police," Calder added. "No publicity. The ambassador's reputation, and, frankly, that of several nations, is at stake." Wolfe gave him a look that could have chilled soup. "I am not the Department of State," he said, "nor do I sanitize murder to accommodate diplomacy. If you wish for silence, you have come to the wrong brownstone." Calder slid a second item. "Hangovers." Wolfe ignored me. "I will also need whatever communication passed between the ambassador and your office in the 72 hours prior to his death, preferably unredacted." Calder nodded once. "You'll have it within the hour." "Then I accept." I didn't hear a gavel, but the courtroom was definitely in session. Wolfe didn't wait for dessert. "Mirov," he said, "the aide." He poured the drink. "He also vanished before the toast was dry," I added. "No one's seen him since." Wolfe scowled. "Then we must." He handed me a small notepad, Wolfe's version of a mission order, with 6 names scribbled in that neat, ancient handwriting of his. "Start here. Guests with security clearances. Attachés. The chef, if possible. You want me to charm diplomats, chase a missing man, and squeeze secrets out of people trained not to blink under pressure?" "Yes." He didn't look up from his orchids. I pocketed the list, already calculating which club maitre d' I'd have to bribe with bourbon. Wolfe added, "And Goodwin, if you encounter resistance, I'll smile politely and take notes anyway." He gave a curt nod, and just like that, the great chessboard was set. Wolfe had moved his first pawn. Now it was my turn. It happened outside the Diplomatic Club, right as I was sliding my notebook back into my coat. He stepped beside me like he'd been conjured, tall, tan, sharp-suited, with a diplomat's smile and a predator's eyes. His accent was British, but polished, like it had spent a decade in Geneva. "Mr. Goodwin, isn't it?" "I don't deny it," I said. He held up a small ID wallet, just long enough for me to catch a diplomatic seal and a name I was supposed to forget. Then he lowered his voice. "Some glasses, Mr. Goodwin," he said, "are meant to be raised, not examined." I smiled. Funny. I've always preferred to check the bottom before I sip. His grin widened, but the eyes didn't follow. We'd all prefer this matter remain sealed. No need to uncork trouble. He adjusted his cufflink, nodded once and walked away. The kind of man who left behind cologne, questions, and the distinct feeling you'd just been threatened in 3 languages. I made another mental note. Wolfe was going to love this guy. But me? I already wanted to trip him with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Luc Durand's art gallery was nestled between a cigar lounge and a hat shop that hadn't updated its window display since the Hoover administration. The sign out front read Galerie du Passage, which was accurate. You passed right by unless you were looking for overpriced brushwork or a front for something less decorative. Inside, the walls were dotted with abstract smears, pretending to be modern. One Monet hung at a slight angle and looked like it had been painted by a drunk with a grudge against water lilies. A woman in a turtleneck offered espresso and glared at my shoes. Durand himself emerged from the back, wearing a linen jacket too crisp for a man who allegedly worked with pigment. "Can I help you?" he asked, accent perfectly poised between Paris and pretense. "Just browsing," I said. "I'm fond of landscapes, especially ones not stolen." He smiled, tight, unrevealing. I left a fake name in the guest book and a real note in my brain. The guy had the hands of someone who'd never framed anything but an alibi. Whatever Luc Durand was dealing in, it wasn't canvas. And if he'd ever seen Monet, I'd bet it was through binoculars during a heist in Marseille. Durand left the gallery at precisely 5:17 p.m., carrying a leather satchel and smelling faintly of expensive cologne and mild panic. I tailed him down Madison, like a shadow with a filing cabinet. He didn't glance back once, which told me either he was confident or clueless. I had a hunch it was the first. He made a sharp turn into the Centurion Club, a building so exclusive it didn't have a front door, just a man with a list and a look that could curdle investment portfolios. I waited until the next cluster of members arrived and slipped in behind them, nodding like I belonged. Inside, everything whispered old money. Deep rugs, crystal chandeliers. Bar other had a Slavic rasp and a temper he kept hidden behind polished vowels. They went quiet for a minute, then something about containment and repercussions. The kind of words people don't use over drinks unless someone died at their request. I didn't catch everything. The jazz player picked that moment for a solo, but I heard enough. Toast, parchment, a diplomatic mess swept under a velvet rug. Wolfe had suspected poison. I was starting to think he'd underestimated it. This wasn't about one man's death. It was about who wanted silence, and how loud they were willing to scream if they didn't get it. I stepped out into the night air and nearly tripped over a trench coat with a badge inside. Inspector Kramer. His jaw was tight. His eyes were stormy. His hands were in fists, not because he was ready to fight, but because he wasn't allowed to. "Following foreign nationals now, Goodwin," he growled. "Just taking in the arts. You'd like the gallery. Lots of fakes." He didn't bite. "I know Wolfe sniffing around the ambassador's death. I also know you were spotted at the catering firm, the wine rack, and now tailing Duran. Duran's an art dealer, and I'm the Queen of Sweden." He stepped closer. "I'm telling you, and by extension that gourmet blimp you work for, to back off. The State Department's breathing down our necks, and if this turns into an international incident, it won't be Wolfe who gets blamed. I smiled. Wolfe doesn't breathe necks. He devours hypocrisy. Kramer scowled. Just stay out of my way. He stomped off into a waiting car, slamming the door like it owed him answers. I lit a cigarette I didn't want, just to give my hands something to do. The law was rattled, which meant Wolfe was probably close. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was engaged in his second beer and the last of Fritz's lamb croquettes when I relayed Kramer's little tantrum. He didn't blink. If Mr. Kramer believes proximity to government pressure equates to moral clarity, Wolfe said, he should consider a transfer to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. He thinks we're making trouble, I said. Wolfe arched a brow. We? Number. I am unmovable. You are merely inconvenient. Thanks, Wolfe sipped. The ambassador was silenced. Deliberately. That's murder, not politics. You don't think State will bury it? I expect they'll do their best, he said. But the truth, Mr. Goodwin, has the irritating habit of surviving improper burial. I left him to his beer and musings. Wolfe might be immovable, but the ground under this case was starting to shift. And someone, somewhere, wanted it to swallow us both. It was late when the knock came. Not the bell, the knock, deliberate. 3 soft raps that suggested gloves, secrets, and a federal pension. I opened the door to a man in a diplomatic courier uniform. No name, no words. Just a small sealed envelope, embossed, weighted, and smelling faintly of tobacco and expensive leather. For Mr. Wolfe, he said. Wolfe took the envelope in silence, studied it, then, to my surprise, didn't open it. He placed it beside his beer like it might grow teeth. You expecting fan mail? I asked. No, he said. But I am expecting pretense. The envelope remained unopened for a full 5 minutes. Then Wolfe, with the air of a man flipping a page in a mediocre novel, slid a blade under the seal and pulled out a single folded sheet. He read it once, then again, slower. This is not a red herring, he murmured. It's the hook. And from the look in his eyes, someone had just handed him bait soaked in blood. And Wolfe was ready to bite. Wolfe opened the envelope with the care of a man defusing a bomb. His thumb barely grazed the flap, yet it parted like it had been waiting. The tiniest lurch. Whatever this was, it wasn't an invitation to tea. Wolfe read aloud with the precision of a hangman reading final rites. No drama, no embellishment, just slow, clean, and merciless. Shipment confirmed under diplomatic seal. Route secured via Marseille, Tangier, Lisbon. Funds routed through shell entities B and G. U.S. intermediary, Senator. He paused, looked up, and blinked once. Name redacted. He glanced at me like I was the chalkboard and he was about to diagram treason. Now I've heard Wolfe read bad restaurant menus with more warmth. But this wasn't about taste. This was geopolitics dressed in a tuxedo. And Wolfe knew better than anyone that tuxedos hide a lot of knives. I didn't crack a wisecrack. When Wolfe's tone gets that calm, it's like the eye of a tornado. Beautiful, centered, and usually followed by airborne livestock. Arms deal, he said. Private players. Government fronts. The ambassador's reception was more than diplomatic theatre. It was a chessboard. I nodded, though it felt more like the kind of nod you give a guillotine before it drops. There was no mention of murder, but the words had weight, And it didn't take Herculean deduction to realize someone had died to keep this quiet. The question was, who else had read this before us? The handwritten note, penned in quick, stylish loops, was far more direct than the cable. No letterhead, no signature. Just 4 words on the top line and a very expensive threat below. Burn this if you value your life. Others didn't. I looked at Wolfe. So, shall I fetch a match and a burial plot? He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his reading glass and angled the paper toward the window like it owed him answers. No fingerprints, he muttered. Quality ink. A faint tremor in the downstrokes. A left-handed writer, or one with damaged nerves. Or one nervous about dying, I offered.
He grunted. The phrasing is theatrical, possibly translated, possibly not. The use of the word others is particularly galling.
You mean vague?
No, Wolfe said, still scanning the loops. I mean performative. They want to threaten without confessing why they threaten. That is not how genuine murderers operate. It is how cowards behave when afraid their allies may turn into enemies. That shut me up. He slid the paper to the edge of the desk and tapped it once. Do not burn it, Archie. Do not touch it further. We will need the original. He leaned back. Now we find the hand that penned it. When Wolfe says now, he means now, unless it involves standing up. So, I took my marching orders straight to the Savile Club's front desk, which was manned by a secretary who had the jaw of an ex-governor and the politeness of a grand piano. I'd like to review the guest book from the ambassador's reception, I told him with my best smile and worst badge flash. Sir, he said, eyebrows ascending, we do not display our guests like trophies on a shelf. No, you keep them in a drawer, and I'd like to peek. He harumphed. That's not an exaggeration. The man literally harumphed. It took some careful manoeuvring. Compliments on the club's architecture, a casual nod towards the doorman's suspiciously shiny pinky ring, and a whispered suggestion that the IRS might be reviewing club membership soon. I got 5 minutes with the sign-in ledger and a blotting pad older than Fritz's sourdough starter. The book was mostly flourishes and fake names. Spies love aliases the way ducks love water. But a few entries had the kind of ink that lingers, expensive and dark, like secrets steeped in Turkish coffee. And one of those flourishes rang a bell, or maybe it was Wolfe's eyebrow again. The looped L tilted left, like it had lost faith in gravity. The E at the end of Le Chantre curved backward, polite but defiant. I traced it with my eyes, not my fingers, Wolfe's rule. The guest book entry read, Le Chantre, Ministerial Attaché, Al-Hudaira. Sounded fancy, sounded fake. But the handwriting matched our unsigned death note with the smug confidence of a villain monologuing before the bomb goes off. The club and stepped into air so thick with secrets, it felt like a second coat. Time to go home and find something missing. I stepped into the brownstone and felt it immediately, the offness. Like someone had opened a window on a rainy day, then closed it before the floorboards noticed. No sign of forced entry. No upturned rugs. No dramatic calling cards left on the stairs. Just one thing. Fritz's Tuesday afternoon tea tray was gone. Now Fritz would sooner misplace his appendix than misplace the Royal Doulton with hand-painted violets. I went straight to the kitchen. He was there, arms crossed, lips tighter than a banker at confession. They took the tray, he said. Define they. I was airing linens. 10 minutes, no more. When I returned, the tea service had vanished. No broken locks? None. I stalked to Wolfe's office. He was seated, naturally, fingers steepled and eyes half-lidded, the very picture of grim contemplation. They were here, I said. They didn't take the cable. Didn't touch your beer, just the tea.
Wolfe opened one eye. "Not the tea," he said softly. "The tray." I blinked. "Why?" He rose, actually stood up, and walked to the kitchen shelf. He tapped the empty space with one thick finger. They wanted something I hadn't seen, yet. And that, my friends, chilled me more than the threat note ever did. I was halfway through a perfectly average Tuesday when I got the call that twisted it into a corkscrew. East River, north of Williamsburg Bridge. Body pulled. Russian. Thought you'd want to know. The voice belonged to a guy in homicide who owed me 2 favors and an embarrassing poker loss. I thanked him and burned rubber in a yellow cab straight to the morgue. The sheet got pulled back with the kind of flourish you reserve for magician acts or meat counters. Alexei Mirov, sharp-suited diplomat turned soggy corpse, lay there with an expression that didn't match any version of suicide I'd ever seen. Next to his waterlogged jacket, an empty pill bottle and a suicide note that might as well have been printed on Kremlin letterhead. Neat, tragic, sealed with sorrow. Too neat. Mirov didn't strike me as the leave a note type. The man lived like every conversation was bugged and every drink poisoned. And even dead, he didn't look peaceful. He looked surprised. Back at the brownstone, I tossed the report on Wolfe's desk. He didn't look up. "Suicide," I said. He glanced at the report. "Nonsense." And just like that, the corkscrew twisted deeper. Wolfe read the note in Russian aloud, his voice low and deliberate, the syllables gliding like icicles down a stone wall. The translation on the police copy had made it sound like a Dostoevsky swan song, full of guilt, regret, and just enough vague remorse to get the embassy off the hook. But Wolfe, he was circling something. He read the last line again, then again. Slower, colder. "The structure is wrong," he muttered. I leaned in. "What kind of wrong?" "Not idiomatic. The verb placement is unnatural. The subject is too direct. No Russian, especially one educated at Leningrad University, would construct a sentence this way." "Meaning?" He looked up from the page and met my eyes. "Meaning he didn't write it." Wolfe tossed the note onto the orchid tray like it had personally insulted his vocabulary. The grammar was dressed for a funeral. It wants to sound Russian, but it's as artificial as canned borscht. I nodded. "And the pills?" "Empty bottle. No trace of residue in the mouth or under the nails. Suicide by pill rarely involves going for a swim." Wolfe's tone dropped half a step. "He didn't take the pills, Mr. Goodwin." He was silenced. Wolfe sat back, fingertips pressed together, as if building a cathedral from silence. "He was loyal," he said. That wasn't something Wolfe handed out like business cards. Loyalty, in his book, ranked just below orchids and just above on Wolfe's suspicions and my own allergy to coincidences. Now, with the envelope of 5x7 black and white glossies in front of me, I played photo roulette. 3 shots of the ballroom, 2 of the ambassador giving a toast, 1 blurry kiss near the champagne fountain, the usual diplomatic carnage. Then I hit pay dirt. Alexei Mirov, arm bent at a gentlemanly angle, standing beside none other than Lenore Parr, daughter of Senator Gilman Parr, silk scarf aficionado, and one of the loudest mouths on foreign policy this side of the Potomac. She was smiling, but not for the camera. She was smiling at Mirov. And unless my eyes were playing pinball, his hand was lightly touching the small of her back. I stared at it for a while. Mirov, who wasn't supposed to socialize off script, caught cozy with the senator's daughter? That wasn't just personal. That was dynamite in a dress. Wolfe held the photo like a judge reading a forgery. Skeptical, unsmiling, and 3 degrees short of thunder. She was present at the ambassador's toast, he said flatly. Yeah, she laughed at his joke. I figured she was flirting with the champagne bar. Wolfe's lips curled. She was too close. That moment was not mere conviviality. It was positioning. Positioning for what? He tapped the image. Leverage. And concealment. I raised an eyebrow. You think Mirov heard something at the toast? He was close. Closer than permitted. If that moment was private, then what he overheard was not meant for him. He let the photo drop to the desk. And now he's dead. Staged, silenced, thrown into a river with a note tailored for political convenience. Fritz entered with the afternoon coffee, but even the aroma couldn't cut the tension. Wolfe leaned back, eyes narrowing like storm shutters. The circle tightens, Archie. I've never been fond of playing usher, but that afternoon, I played it like a maestro conducting a funeral march. One by one, the suspects came up the steps of the brownstone, looking like they'd been summoned by an IRS agent with a grudge. Luke Durand arrived first, olive-toned, tailored, and chewing gum like it was state-sponsored. Isabel Vance followed, draped in chiffon and tension. The ambassador's aide, Viktor Korolyev, looked like he hadn't slept since the Cold War ended. And bringing up the rear, Lenore Parr, the senator's daughter, still clutching the handbag that had started more rumours than a Broadway chorus line. Fritz opened the salon door with the gravity of a man presenting a last meal. He'd laid out the drinks, chilled vodka for the Russians, sherry for the Americans, and club soda for the cowards. No one touched a drop. A bit in, take a seat, I told them, gesturing with the kind of smile that isn't. They obeyed, slowly, like they thought the chairs might explode. Wolfe had yet to appear, which meant the unease in the room had time to steep like overbrewed tea. And when Wolfe lets the tension steep, you'd better believe the pour is going to scald. When Wolfe finally entered, it was less an entrance and more a declaration of sovereignty. He crossed the threshold like a battleship slipping into harbour, slow, immense, and utterly unconcerned with your opinion. He settled into the red chair like it had been waiting all day to feel important again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, folding his hands over his stomach. "Thank you for your punctuality. I presume you're all aware why you're here." No one answered. "Good," he said. "Then I won't insult your intelligence, even if some of you have done so yourselves." He reached for the stack of notes beside his beer. Yes, Fritz had brought the bottle in like it was a ceremonial torch, and adjusted his glasses with a precision that might have sliced marble. "When murder disguises itself as diplomacy," he said, "it falls to me to undress the illusion." And believe me, he was already tugging at the first thread. Wolfe lifted the first card from his stack, eyed it briefly, and looked up. "Ambassador Vasiliev," he said, "did not die from anything ingested during the toast." Durand snorted. Ceremony masked the sauce. He paused, savouring it. It wasn't sabotage at the banquet. It was preparation, earlier, by someone with access. And suddenly, everyone in the room was thirsty, but no one reached for a drink. Wolfe didn't raise his voice, but the effect was the same as a hammer on porcelain. He produced the napkin from the sealed envelope I'd handed him 20 minutes earlier, the one I'd found in the lounge, folded with military precision and kissed with burgundy lipstick. "Miss Vance," he said, his tone as neutral as an alibi. "You stated you had no personal interaction with the ambassador prior to the evening's toast." She nodded slowly. "I didn't." "Then you must have a twin," I offered, "who smokes Dunhills and wears shade 512 from Laverne of Paris." Her eyes darted to the napkin Wolfe now unfolded, exposing the faint outline of a lipstick smear and a partial monogram. "I.V.," Wolfe said, "not the ambassador's. Yours." "I dropped it," she whispered. "Yes," Wolfe said, "after you brought him his vodka. Alone." Mid-afternoon. Korolev turned toward her, color draining like a busted radiator. "You were not scheduled to visit," Wolfe added, "which is precisely why you did." She looked like she was folding inward. "You carried the glass," he finished, "and you lied about it." In the silence that followed, you could have heard Fritz setting down a fork in the kitchen, and it would have sounded like thunder. Isabel looked like she'd swallowed an ice cube, and it was still working its way down. Wolfe waited precisely 4 seconds, long enough for discomfort to settle, then continued. "The ambassador had in his possession," he said, "a letter implicating Senator Parr in a covert deal involving East European arms shipments. If released, it would not merely ruin a career, it would end it." All heads turned toward Lenore. She didn't flinch, but her knuckles were white against the armrest. Wolfe kept going. "Miss Vance is close to the Parr family." She would have understood the implications of that letter.
"But why would he share it with her?" Durand asked, scorn on his tongue. "He didn't," Wolfe said, "but she discovered it, likely while renewing her lipstick." His pause was elegant. "She acted not for personal gain, but in the interest of someone else's future." I stole a glance at Isabel. Her expression had gone from denial to something more like resignation. And in that silence, the weight of legacy pressed heavier than guilt. As Wolfe once told me, justice isn't always personal, but motive usually is. Wolfe turned next to Luc Durand, who had stopped chewing gum and started clenching his jaw. "Mr. Durand," Wolfe said, "you are not a diplomat. You are a facilitator. Your entry to the embassy was cleared not for politics, but for access." Durand crossed one leg over the other, cool as a sidewalk in November. "You've been reading spy novels, monsieur." "I've been reading your travel logs," Wolfe replied, "and the customs reports that show your presence in Zurich, Lyon, and Dubai, all cities associated with the biocompound later found in the ambassador's bloodstream." Durand's smile faltered. "You had access to the poison, to the ambassador's quarters, and to the guest list." "I was invited," Durand shot back. "You invited yourself," Wolfe said, "just as you invited death into the glass." Durand laughed, a single bark that didn't stick. Wolfe rose slightly in his chair, just enough to press the air flat. "You were paid to remove a liability. You delivered." The room had gone corpse quiet. "And yet," Wolfe added, voice softer, "you were not paid to survive the truth." Durand's knuckles twitched. "Archie," Wolfe said, "you may remove Mr. Durand's passport from his coat pocket." And just like that, cool turned cold. The salon was a held breath when Wolfe turned toward Isabel one last time. "But it wasn't you who poured the glass," he said. "You didn't lace it." She blinked. "No, but it was you," Wolfe said quietly, "who gave the signal, the final toast, the nod to drink." She didn't speak.
You didn't need to poison him, Wolfe said. Only to time it. Isabel's face was a war but kind either. This was late curtain, final act, spotlight on the devil in the details. Ladies and gentlemen, Wolfe began, which is Wolfe speak for prepare to be dismantled. The timeline is no longer a matter of speculation. It is, as the saying goes, a matter of record. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried across the salon like a gavel. He laid out the afternoon like a military campaign. At 4:02, Durand slipped away from the patio. At 4:05, a call came into the front desk. No voice, just a hang-up, but timed perfectly to pull the staff's attention. By 4:06, the ambassador's vodka glass had been switched with the doctored one. The real toast, Wolfe said, happened at 4:10, when Isabel Vance lifted her glass, smiled with just enough sincerity to throw off suspicion, and nodded like a stage cue. Each person in the room shifted under the weight of Wolfe's gaze. He wasn't accusing, he was assigning roles. Isabel, the signal. Durand, the hand. Mirov, the casualty of curiosity. The senator. Well, Wolfe hadn't yet hung his medal. He paused for breath. A murder committed with the elegance of a sonata. Too bad the final note was off-key. And that's when I saw it, the first flicker of fear in Isabel's eyes. Wolfe, never one for theatrics unless he was the centre of them, took a breath and lowered his gaze to Isabel. It was a simple toast, he said, but then simple gestures often carry the most weight. He described the scene like a painter recalling his own brushstrokes. Isabel standing beside the ambassador, smiling as though all was forgiven. Glass raised, just a beat before everyone else's. That half-second difference, so small no one registered it, was everything. Durand had been watching for it. That was the cue. The timing, Wolfe said, was immaculate. Isabel's smile had been studied, practiced, perfect. Too perfect. I stole a glance her way. She was staring at Wolfe now, not blinking. The lady had used her charm like a scalpel, and Wolfe had just named the wound, but we weren't done bleeding yet. You could almost feel the room stiffen when Wolfe spoke Mirov's name. It wasn't reverent, but it was quieter. Mirov, Wolfe said, was an aide with inconvenient integrity. Now, when Wolfe starts praising a man for that kind of thing, you know the poor sap's already dead, or soon to be. And sure enough, Wolfe detailed how Mirov, sharp-eyed and sharper-minded than most in that glittering mess of diplomats, had noticed the glass had moved, the wrong condensation ring, the lipstick mark vanishing, a trick of light, a twist of curiosity, enough to kill him. Wolfe speculated that Mirov had gone to confront Durand not long after the toast. Not with accusations, just questions. Dangerous, inconvenient questions. He became, Wolfe said, a problem. Arching his fingers together, Wolfe glanced down briefly, as if paying a silent tax for the observation. Then, as ever, he moved on. Mirov hadn't been part of the original plan, but like any good improvisation, murder accommodates interruption. No one in the room spoke. Even Durand, arms crossed, wore a smirk that had just one corner left. The loyal man had stepped in too far. And now, Wolfe had dragged him back out, one truth at a time. Wolfe wasn't big on metaphors, but when he found one, it cut like a straight razor. Durand, he said, is not loyal to a nation, but to a function. He is a blade, efficient, disposable, and entirely without flag. Durand leaned against the mantel with his arms crossed, as if Wolfe had just offered him a cigar. But you could see the twitch in his jaw. The game was up. and Wolfe wasn't giving him the dignity of a banner to die under. Poison is easy to acquire, Wolfe continued. But this one, tasteless, undetectable under vodka and effective within minutes, is not from any apothecary in the city. He let that hang. Julian shrugged. You say I'm a tool. Every country uses them. That's precisely the problem, Wolfe replied. There was no victory in Wolfe's tone. Just cold, his fingers toward the stack of papers he'd compiled, like offering bones to a scavenger. This is not a murder solved. It is a mechanism exposed. Arrest who you like, Kramer, but don't ask me to wear the badge. Kramer's jaw twitched like he was chewing glass. And me, I was already bracing for the moment someone would slam a door. But the one that mattered hadn't opened yet. Calder stood, smoothing his tie like it might save his soul. I assume this document, he said, should vanish. Wolfe gave a fractional nod. Not vanish. Drift toward a journalist, perhaps. One with a spine. Calder didn't argue. That's how you know when a man's been broken in the right places. He took the envelope Wolfe slid across the desk with the same care you'd give a lit match. I walked him to the door. No handshake. Just 2 steps in silence and one polite lie. Good luck. He nodded once, not looking back. Wolfe watched from his chair, unmoving, as if sealing something inside a vault he'd built with words. The lock clicked. The room was quiet again, and the story, the real one, had already begun walking toward the press. The check came in an envelope thick enough to choke a conscience. Wolfe opened it, eyed the amount, then set it down with 2 fingers like he was holding a used handkerchief. I will not be footnoted, he said. Not by history. Not by scandal. You're turning it down? I asked. Wolfe stared at the fireplace. Money is compensation. I prefer clarity. The envelope sat on the tray, untouched. Outside, the city was still turning, but something had stopped inside the brownstone. And me? I was already wondering how to write the report, because when a case closes without applause, you have to listen harder for the echo. Wolfe was in full-throttle metaphysical bloom, which meant he was leaning back in the big chair with his eyes half-lidded and his fingers pressed together like they were negotiating a ceasefire. The tragedy of diplomacy, he intoned, lies in the assumption that nations possess honor. They do not. Only men do. And even that, rarely. That was the 3rd tragedy he'd mentioned in the last 10 minutes. I was starting to suspect he had a subscription to some tragic philosopher's quarterly. I sat in my chair, legs crossed, notebook open, not writing a word. That's the trick with Wolfe. He doesn't want an audience. He wants a witness. Preferably one with ears and without opinions. Do you know, Archie, he continued, what the Greeks called justice? I didn't, but I also knew better than to say a sandwich. Dike, balance. Not revenge, not law. Balance. What has occurred in this case, unsung though it may remain, is precisely that. A re-weighting. He took a long breath, as though he'd just unburdened the Parthenon. Sure, I said, but will the balance include dessert? Wolfe gave me a look usually reserved for door-to-door evangelists, but I wasn't kidding. If I was going to sit through an entire treatise on international morality dressed as murder, I deserved pie, or at least a decent cup of coffee. Whatever else happened, I needed sugar before we got to the part about the moral collapse of empires. Fritz outdid himself. Again. The dining room smelled like Tsarist Russia, all butter, paprika, and a hint of something tragic in the beef. I used brandy instead of vodka for the flambé, he whispered to me, like it was a state secret. But Mr. Wolfe won't know. I glanced at Wolfe, one button unfastened on the vest. That alone could have made the United Nations rethink its strategy. He never did it for comfort, only relief. The stroganoff came out rich and honest. Egg noodles cooked to a Protestant firmness. Mushrooms sautéed like they'd been born for the pan. Wolfe made a pleased noise at the second bite, which, in Fritz's world, was equivalent to a parade. The proper balance of cream and acid, Wolfe murmured. Rare. I raised my glass of vodka, Fritz's doing, chilled and crystal clear, and gave the room a mock toast. To rare.
Wolfe grunted from behind the orchid trays. I turned. The obit column, nestled between a recipe for prune cobbler and an ad for gum disease cream, said the ambassador had suffered a sudden cardiac event. The only event, Wolfe said, is that history wears gloves when it strangles. That was his version of swearing. I poured him coffee, added precisely 1 sugar, and handed it over. Still no credit for us, I said, not even a whisper. I neither acquire it nor respect it, he said. Fame is the newspaper's reward for theatre. We are not in the theatre, Archie. No, I said, folding the paper. We're backstage, cleaning up the blood and hiding the spotlight, buried in the back pages, under classifieds and above the horoscopes, was a slim op-ed, unsigned. The byline read simply, "A concerned citizen," which in New York narrows it down to about 7 million suspects. But the content? That was Wolfe all right. The recent shift in European arms inventories, it read, owes less to peace treaties than to private ambitions. It went on, in language dry enough to powder your teeth, to describe an informal consortium of players manipulating regional tensions for financial gain. It didn't name the ambassador. It didn't have to. Anyone with half a brain and 2 fingers on the pulse of diplomacy would get the message. I showed it to Wolfe. He read it once, exhaled through his nose, and arched one eyebrow. That's Wolfe speak for bravo. You wrote it? I asked. I dictated, he said, to Calder. So the senator had earned his exit after all. Quiet, deniable, and razor-sharp. Wolfe sipped his coffee. A sword, Archie, he said, does not need applause. Only precision. And with that, he turned his chair toward the orchids, leaving me to wonder if the flowers were the only things that ever got a real standing ovation in that house. Wolfe's hands were in the orchid pots. You could always tell when he was in a contemplative mood. He stopped talking and let the ferns do the thinking for him. Justice, he said finally, is not spectacle. It is rhythm. That was new. I'd heard justice compared to a blade, a balance, a blindfold, and a punch in the mouth. Rhythm was a fresh one. The ambassador will never stand trial, Wolfe went on. Nor will Durand. Nor will the financiers who arranged the meeting. But there is consequence. There is rhythm. A pattern disrupted. A secret exposed. A man silenced. You think Mirov gets a gold star in the afterlife? I asked. I think, Wolfe said, he did what most men will not. He stood between power and its meal. I stayed quiet. Sometimes Wolfe's morality had to echo in its own chamber before it sounded like wisdom. He dusted his fingers and moved to his chair, the sun catching the edge of his sleeve like a stage light. He settled in, heavy and assured. Isabel is in hiding. Calder will not run again. The arms shipment is cancelled, and I have declined the remainder of our fee. That last one made me blink. Wolfe turned those who prefer comfort over clarity. I didn't press. He was in post-verdict mode, half judge, half monk. I walked to my desk, opened a new notebook and jotted a few lines. There were no headlines, no names, but somewhere in the ink of an unsigned op-ed, the truth lived, and somewhere in a closet, Mirov's suit still held the faint scent of loyalty. Maybe that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe Wolfe did it for the rhythm,
Maybe I stuck around for the counterpoint. Or maybe we both just liked seeing the bad guys twitch, even if it never made the evening news. I closed the notebook. No applause, just echoes. And that was the music Wolfe liked best. In the end, no medals were pinned, no names etched in granite. The silence of the newspapers was not an oversight. It was the price of preserving illusion. Yet within the quiet walls of the brownstone, where orchids thrive on patience and precision, a different kind of justice unfolded. It didn't roar, it whispered. And that whisper was enough. Sometimes, the most dangerous lies wear tailored suits and diplomatic pins. But truth, reluctant, bruised, persistent, still finds its way to the light. Would you have exposed the truth, knowing it would vanish into shadows the moment it surfaced? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.